I'm here representing the Military Advisory Board at CNA, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. I spent 35 years as an officer, 39 years in the uniform of the nation as a sailor. My last sea job, I was commander of the amphibious force in the 3rd Fleet, and my last shore job, my last job of all in my Navy career was I was Inspector General of the Navy Department, the Marine Corps and the Navy. When I left the Navy active duty, I was hired by CNA to develop a non-defense business in what was essentially a defense-oriented organization that is a nonprofit research company that has linked science to policy since 1942. The first engagement of the Center for Naval Analyses was with the U.S. Navy at the request of the President of the United States. And President Roosevelt asked some professors from MIT and Columbia to go to sea with the Navy to examine the problem of the U-boat threat in the Atlantic. This was in 1942. That was the first serious issue for defense that was undertaken by what eventually became the Center for Naval Analyses. Center for Naval Analyses still exists. My job for 14 years at the CNA Corporation was to create a similarly aligned organization in non-defense, working for federal, state, and local clients in education, agriculture, homeland security, justice, and energy, water, and climate. So my enthusiasm for this, which regrettably doesn't predate my retirement from the Navy, because I would pull my frigate alongside an oiler at sea underway, and I would take on 150 or 200,000 gallons of fuel oil at a time. My concern was the range I would get out of my tanks and nothing else with regard to energy. But I've come to realize, both in my experience at CNA as a division director and since as a member of the Military Advisory Board, the extraordinarily close linkage between energy and national security. I hope I can talk to you today in ways that will be useful to you about those connections. All right, the Military Advisory Board at CNA, it was formed in 2006. Sherry Goodman, the Honorable Sherry Goodman, who was a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy and the Environment and was our General Counsel at CNA at the time, invited 11 retired 3- and 4-star officers to come to CNA and conduct, through a process of periodic meetings with the research staff at CNA, an analysis of climate change as it relates to national security. The first report they issued was in 2007 and was about specifically the national security implications of climate change. The kind of future in which American young men and women will be asked to go and fight or conduct humanitarian operations or a variety of security-related kind of enterprises, and the conditions around the world that would place demand on them to do that. Both of those are profoundly affected by climate change. That first report made a big splash. It was updated in 2014 by some other members of the Military Advisory Board. In the meantime, there were 3 reports produced on energy with specific issues on the international ties that we're forced to make because at the time we were continuing to rely on vast imports of oil. And the really thorny problem for the Defense Department as the inevitable transition to advanced energy gains momentum of transportation fuels. So we thought it was important to focus on those issues. And we have produced a couple of reports that will form the basis for my conversation with you today. And I'll talk about those. I just wanted to point out that there are some, aside from Gunn, there are some really cool folks on this Military Advisory Board. There are now 35 of us. We just picked a representative sample. Lori Robinson, a four-star, the first woman four-star Air Force general, was the Systems Command commander. Jim Conway was the commandant of the Marine Corps. Skip Bowman was the director of naval reactors. Paul Kern was the Army commander for all U.S. operations. Chuck Wald was the Air Combat Commander for the Air Force at Langley Air Force Base, and it goes on. Ed Rondeau was the president of the National Defense University. So let me talk about these three things with you today, and I'll get into some detail on each of them. But the skeleton of this, the structure of this is I want to talk about the vulnerability of the electrical grid, its deficiencies, and some of the things that can be done, need to be done, must be done in order to address those deficiencies as we shift to a new world of energy. Then I'd like to talk about the energy landscape, which is going to bring about this transition to a new world of energy. And then I'd like to talk about the fact that there are serious economic opportunities for those who lead and missed opportunities for those who fail to lead in this worldwide transition to advanced energy. All right. With regard to the vulnerability and fragility of the grid, I'd like to talk about these specific things. We really depend on it for everything. It is extraordinarily vulnerable to physical as well as cyber attacks and accidents of nature. There are trends and technologies that we need to acknowledge and promote to replace it, and then there is, after all, a militarily essential role for electrical supply for bases like Nellis and Fallon and Creech and places like that. And I think, and I'm going to wrap up at the end and say that I think that Nevada is uniquely positioned because of its fortunate geography, climatology, and even more important, the energy and innovation of Nevada people to lead this transition in the U.S. Well, we depend on the electrical grid for everything. One only need to look at that period when there was a blackout on the eastern seaboard that was caused, this was in 07 or 08, I'm a little fuzzy on the dates, but for a period of several days, the East Coast was darkened and New England was darkened by the breakage of a major limb on a tree in Ohio, which took down a piece of the grid. But air traffic control, the piece that failed to get me here on time, that's something we depend on the electrical grid for. Almost all financial transactions at some time or other touch the grid, even if it looks like they're in your and my exact bank. And military operations. It used to be the case that the only business conducted, at least from stateside military bases, was the generation of readiness. That's, after all, what at its foundation each base is there to do, to produce readiness for mission accomplishment, whether it's combat or humanitarian or the like. It's now the case that there can be and is much more reliance on uninterruptible electric power to conduct combat operations remotely. And you see that the greatest example of all in the U.S. military is the drone control from Nellis. And so this is essential. We depend on it for everything, and we rely to get electricity where we need it on a system whose failures today reflect problems with design, difficulties having to do with age, attacks by the weather, which have always been a feature and have been the primary cause of the loss of power, except, by the way, one of the things we learned in this study is that the primary loss of power, although only temporarily and only in small areas, is squirrels. You learn all sorts of things in conducting these national security studies. So we're going to sick the seals on the squirrels. It seems appropriate. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about attacks, actually attacks that have happened. The first vulnerability is design. There are several issues with design, but my takeaway from the work that we did in trying to understand how serious the threats were from a national security perspective to America's grid, the most serious thing I took away was being convinced that it was actually, it's too elegant to call it design. It happened. And the way it happened was the electricity line would run to this county line, and the next time the demand was great enough and the resources were there to extend it to the next county, we did that. And we ended up with a patchwork. I mean, this is a tribute to the ingenuity and the creativity of the people who did it and to their understanding of the demands that the nation was placing for electricity on the system at the time. I'm not denigrating what they did, but that's the way it happened. And now there are pieces that are, and I'm going to talk about age as well, there are pieces that are well more than 100 years old that are still functioning or not. The U.S. grid, and it extends into most of the population of Canada as well, is divided into only 3 segments. That's why the blue segment, much of the blue segment, most of the blue segment went down with the tree limb that broke in Ohio. And the complicated nature of the existing infrastructure is a product, again, not of design, but of expediency at the time when these things were put together. It's old in very large parts. The proximate example, the thing that we all remember from this last year, from the fire season in the West, is the PG&E tower that failed to hold a high tension, a high voltage line. Insulator broke and it dropped, and 15 minutes later the campfire evidently started, and 85 people died and the town of Paradise disappeared. That's not a unique experience. That's an extraordinarily prominent one, but that's not alone. 17 of the last 20 fires that happened in the West Coast are believed to have been, or proven to have been, started by failures of the electrical grid. The particular tower that caused probably the campfire was 99 years old, is 99 years old. And the usable life, the expected lifespan of those towers, that kind of high tension tower, is 75 years at the outside. And those towers are still functioning across America, and some in the East are even older than that. In southern Maryland, a transformer just fell off on a car and killed a woman who was driving past. We all know the problems with the vulnerability due to age, but weather, as I said, is the primary cause of interruptions, of large interruptions in particular of power. And it is the fires. It's also the floods. Nebraska right now is experiencing extraordinarily damaging floods. The communication system, which is not just the radio communications, not just electricity, but also the roads network, the bridges, all of those things are under assault through a combination of the kind of things that I understand Reno is not insusceptible to, that in fact the potential snowpack amount and rains from this previous season might have an impact here as it has in the past. The drought is connected in a couple of ways. The folks in southern Nevada and in a larger service area, of course, are concerned and should be about the fact that if Lake Mead and Lake Powell continue to fall, if the level falls and is below the pickup for the hydroelectric generation system, that there'll be a real power issue in the service area for Hoover Dam. It's not just that. Drought also has an effect on all kinds of combustion energy in some parts of the country. By that I mean, if you're burning coal or you're burning natural gas, you need a water source to cool the system. As importantly, maybe more importantly, nuclear power relies on either water from the sea or from rivers or from cooling ponds that provide the water. In Texas, in 2012, the forecast by the Regional Electrical Authority was that Houston and Dallas would suffer blackouts and rolling brownouts throughout the hottest months of the year because the drought had reduced the level in the cooling ponds to the place where you could no longer operate nuclear power plants at full power. A nice example, this turns out to be, of what an intermittent wind source can do for you. I'd like to think it was designed, but maybe it was serendipity, but in the state of Texas, with its own little electrical grid, as I pointed out, not only can it be isolated from others, but it can be connected to others. But more importantly, in Texas is the state with the largest investment in wind energy. And there are two prominent areas where the wind energy is installed. One is the Panhandle in the north, and the other is on the coast. And when the wind blows in the north, it's not blowing on the coast. When it blows on the coast, it's not blowing in the north. And it's a diurnal kind of operation. So the scarcity of electricity that would result from the loss of the nuclear power source and perhaps combustion energy sources as well was made up for during that summer entirely by wind. And all of those difficulties were avoided. Attack is among the most serious problems. During the 4 years prior to the 2015, 16 issuance of the report, there were 357 physical attacks in the United States on the grid. These are mischief folks. These are people who really wanted to do something. It's human beings deciding that some piece of this vulnerable, in many cases aged infrastructure, would be just a good target. The Metcalf power station, substation in the vicinity of Sacramento was attacked by unknown riflemen. Years later, we don't know who did this, but 17 rifle shots were fired from a distance and struck transformers that took Silicon Valley offline for half a day and much of Central California off for half a day as well. Now the power was restored because the interconnections were made that to provide the energy, but the Metcalf station was offline for the better part of a year. Why is that? It's because we don't stock $1 million transformers in spares because they're $1 million transformers, and we don't build transformers in the United States. They're built in Korea. And so buying them, getting them here, installing them took a long time. The point here is that we need not only to pay attention to our infrastructure, but to pay attention to the factors that affect its reliability beyond the physical structure of the plant. The more serious problem, however, is the guy in the upper right image there with his laptop. During that same time, there were 14 successful attacks on our grid in cyber operations. Successful. There were hundreds of thousands of probes. 14 were successful, actually, by meaning that they took down a portion of the grid or took control of it for a period of time. So that vulnerability is extreme as well, and we were very worried to find out about that. So what is to be done? There are technology trends, I think, that are underway that can be profoundly helpful in this regard. The The idea is that we need to distribute our energy in general in places that are far closer to the consumer, which means smaller generating stations that take advantage of the opportunities that are provided us by the change to new and advanced forms of energy. We need smart grids, which means not only does the grid respond to the demand of the consumer, but the grid also is designed in the world of advanced intelligence, artificial intelligence, to understand when that response is going to be needed and when the demand increase is going to come. All that is increasingly possible. It is the kind of thing that needs to be explored thoroughly by the folks in this country with the support of the research and development community. And then in the case of nanogrids, there are real opportunities emerging in the laboratory. There may be people here who know far more about this than I, but nanotechnology appears to be furnishing a new opportunity to store electricity in fibers, in carbon fibers, without changing it to any other form. And once it needs to be released, releasing it without changing it into either chemical or thermal energy before creating electricity. It's electricity in, it's electricity out. Wow. Now, I don't know how this is going to work out. Again, there may be people here who do, but the fact is that there are such advanced things being explored now that it's not the case that we're stuck with what we've got for the foreseeable future, or that we can watch others in the rest of the world lead us to the next energy revolution. If you look at our disk there in the lower right, it's a little small. What we've tried to do is show on the blue side the generation piece, and on the orange side the consumer piece. We in the Military Advisory Board are believers in the all-above approach to hopefully emission-free or reduced emission generation of electricity. So nuclear power plants, we've got a couple in the United States that are, one is paused in construction, one is going ahead. The regrettable feature of both in the South is that they're way over budget and years behind in delivery. The regrettable part of that is that it's a result, I'm afraid, of a flagging interest in the United States in nuclear power. And partly, of course, everyone is aware here of the spent fuel issue. Small modular nuclear reactors, which can be serving small communities, for example, on short transmission paths. Those opportunities present themselves right now. The Army is currently working on small modular nuclear reactors. For example, a reactor which could be put on a flatbed and driven to the forward edge of the combat area or close to it, and operated from there to provide the necessary electricity and alleviating the problem with convoys. Because the most dangerous part of a military operation, any military operation, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq and places like that, but also at sea, where I come from, is during the process of logistics resupply. And if you can provide a continuous power source, you have changed the shape of the battlefield for our forces, and the Army is looking at that very carefully. Thermal power plants, hydroelectric plants, photovoltaic, solar, wind, and of course also the advent of electrical vehicles, I think, is going to transform the energy landscape. Those who are talking about grids and storage are now counting on the penetration of electric vehicles into the marketplace in sufficient numbers that your home, my home, will eventually become an electrical storage and generating station as well as a consumer, because at least in part the battery capacity of the home will be incorporated in the vehicle. there's just lots going on, and I don't want to drone on with that too long. The military is leading the way. I got ahead of myself a little bit here. The Marines in Afghanistan, before they're not going to wait for the arrival of the nuclear power station, but they needed a source of power. And as a matter of fact, Moms and Pops of America showed the way for a bunch of Marines. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, Jim Conway, as a matter of fact, who's a member of the Military Advisory Board, advertised to all Marines on one occasion that they should send him an email if they had a problem. And so he was besieged with emails, as you can imagine. But some of them, I mean, and they were all important, I got it. But a couple of them, many of them dealt with electrical issues on the front lines. And it turned out that the one that made a profound difference to General Conway was from a second lieutenant, platoon leader, who said that he was a little embarrassed that the Marine Corps did not provide what the moms and pops of the men in his platoon provided. They had gotten together and sent in the mail roll-out solar panels so they could charge their cell phones. Well, that's not just a convenience for Fred to call Tim. That reduces the battery load that patrols had to carry out in this extreme weather conditions that they faced. The pack for a Marine on patrol, if he was going to be out for a week or more, would weigh 110 pounds. And getting rid of 30 pounds of batteries, because you now have a way reliably of charging not only your cell phones, but other communications mechanisms that are important for sustaining the fight. That was a new world. The convoy issue, I talked about vulnerability. 1 in 8 convoys, according to the Army's statistics, resulted in a killed or severely wounded in action. And of course, we've got examples here. We were talking about uninterruptible power being a necessity at Nellis, in particular in the midst of combat operations. The solar power project in the lower left-hand corner is an example. The Naval Weapons Station at China Lake is a geothermal hotspot and takes advantage of that as well. So what about Nevada outside of Nellis and Creech and places like that? I had the opportunity on a couple of previous visits to meet with Governor Sandoval. I haven't met with Governor Sisolak yet, but I'm looking forward to the opportunity perhaps on a future visit to do that. But my view is that Nevada, again, because of its fortunate situation, the circumstance, the ingenuity of the people, the fact that there's momentum already here in transition to advanced energy, the technological advances that are being demonstrated every day in places like Tesla and Spark and others who've been attracted by the climate here. And I don't necessarily mean just the climatology, I mean the climate of Nevada and the innovations that are underway here. They'll attract others as well. And so I think Nevada's going to be on the front lines. And increasingly you see the receptivity of the consumers in the lower right-hand corner to this idea. So I think Nevada, I've told people on many of my state visits, I think this is my 14th or 15th, I don't hesitate to invoke state shaming when I talk in one state about what others are doing. I'll say, well, it's too bad you're missing the opportunity that they're taking advantage of in Nevada. We do a lot of that kind of thing. So, all right, I want to continue to be able to crow about Nevada when I go to state X and state Y and state Z. So, especially California. I'm sorry, I'm just fed some lines I have to use. It pains the UCLA graduate a little, I got to tell you. So let's talk a little bit about the changing energy landscape. I've alluded to that a couple of times. I think I skipped, there's, this is what I mean. It's not as though the changes that we've been talking about are nice to have. the fact is that they're going to be part of our future, and there's a lot we can do about it, not to change it, but to take it in the direction we want it to go. So why are these changes happening? The National Security and Advanced Energy Report a couple of years ago that we put out talked about changing population and demographics, about the nature of electrification of transport and how important that was. And it's not uniformly important everywhere in the world. It depends, at least in part, on how much fossil fuel you currently use for transportation to see what the change will look like. And of course, advanced energy, obtaining energy through advanced techniques has been an important feature of asserting the independence in energy right now of the United States. And I'd like to then talk about renewables more. So the population of the world by the middle of the century is going to go from 9.4 or 5 billion to roughly 11. A billion of that growth, roughly, will be in Africa. 500 million is projected to be in South Asia. Those are the two areas where the people there, the leadership there will be inclined to skip a generation in a variety of things. They're already skipping the generation of installed phone lines. In Africa, there are cell phones everywhere, and there are large large communication networks other than cell towers being built almost nowhere. I think similar things are going to happen in electrification if the power sources are available that will allow that to be the case. In addition to the growth in people numbers, there are going to be lots of folks already on the planet and in the future who join us who will want to join the middle class. That also will increase the demand for electricity. And we anticipate that by mid-century, what we're showing in the graph is India in the black line in population growth, and China leveling off or actually declining by mid-century slightly. It's that factor, it's the middle class factor that looks like a 40% increase. The International Energy Agency says 40% increase in energy demand by the middle of the century. Electrification of transport. In the upper left-hand corner, you see the cost of a 200-mile range or thereabouts electric vehicle. The horizontal dotted line is $35,000. That's the average cost of U.S. Combustion engine vehicles. The electrical vehicle cost is falling toward the lowest cost U.S. combustion engine vehicle. And that is anticipated by 2030 or so. So cost competitiveness is continuing to be a favorable factor for adoption. I've driven, I don't know who's test driven a Tesla. A friend of mine works for Tesla. I was not really in the market for a $120,000 automobile. But I got to tell you, I have a very high power sports car, which I'm ashamed to say does not represent the new change in energy. But I drove a Tesla with the ludicrous setting and the 100 watt battery, 100 megawatt battery, and to 0 to 60, this car would beat mine by 2 seconds at least. So it's an amazing piece of transport. So performance and cost are equalizing, or they're going to turn out to be lots of advantages over the long haul for EVs. The range is increasing, market penetration therefore is increasing, but has to increase a lot. The infrastructure is growing. I know in Nevada that charging stations are being put on the main roads. The pathways to Nevada are going to be pretty easy for people who drive EVs here, or already pretty easy. I think government mandates, talking about the renewable fuel portfolio, or the renewable portfolio standard, I think those are very desirable. I think we need to set targets for ourselves. America used to set targets for itself all the time. Doesn't absolutely mean that we're going to get there, but we're going to work hard enough to aspire to those targets that we're going to learn a heck of a lot along the way, and we're going to give it our best shot. In evidence that others are already in this game, the Chinese have said they'll be selling no internal combustion new vehicles in the country by beginning 2025. Norway has said that about 2025 also. The UK's 2030. You will not be able to buy a Volvo that is not powered by electricity after 2022, I understand. So things are moving in that direction. The shift from oil to electricity, and that the lower graphic is just to indicate there are lots of people increasingly playing in this space. Mercedes is talking about putting out 10 2020 vehicles that are electrified. So we're moving in that direction. And I've also driven a Bolt and a Volt, and they are both great vehicles from Chevrolet. The third trend here is, of course, one you're familiar with. Horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing have changed the nature of oil and gas production in the United States. We still, however, talking about the old tethers that were built in spite of the failure of our trading partners to align with our values in places like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, we still are, or at least were as of last month, the largest buyer of oil from Venezuela. Now, why do we do that when we produce as much oil or more than we need and we're beginning to export it? We do that simply because of the location of the processing in the United States. And since the refineries largely that can deal with the heavy crude from Venezuela are in the south, we buy it there and then we refine the higher quality crude and we export it. Anyway, the point is that some of these tethers that were formed during the oil age and the coal age remain and will be with us as long as those fuels continue to be a primary way of generating electricity around the world. Production is driven by price, more probably with fracking than any other production technique. It's really expensive. And when you frack a well, you need to frack it again 5 years later, and again 5 years later, until the well peters out. So there are additional costs. Once the production process is in operation, it doesn't necessarily mean it's there forever. We are a net energy exporter, but it's still a global commodity. By that I mean we do not control the price. People talk about energy independence in the United States. We could only be independent if we produced the price. If we controlled the volume that affected the price, then we would be energy independent. What we are now is energy self-sufficient, and that's substantially different. We need to be energy self-sufficient because we've led the charge into advanced energy. And in renewables, exciting things are happening. This graph shows the fact that our challenge is that for advanced energy, the numbers are small. You can double your advanced energy. A question. You can double your use of advanced energy, but if you only had a penetration of 1%, it doesn't matter nearly as much as it will in the long haul. So the blue here it's the predominant issue for world generation out through the end of 2017 is fossil fuels. The one above it is nuclear. And by the way, the 99 nuclear reactors in the United States, in spite of their spent fuel issues, need to be continuing to operate because they provide 20% of the U.S. Electricity. We've just got to figure it out. Hydroelectric is next in the green. Geo, biothermal, others are just this little tiny line above that. And you can see that wind and solar are still, as the end of 2017, not providing nearly as much as the publicity a nice, good public understanding, I think, would have you believe. And one of the issues is how we talk about these advanced energies, the renewables. What we're showing here is the estimated renewable energy share of global electricity production at the end of 2017. Again, the International Energy Authority. This is provided by Renewables 2018 Global Status Report. That's really an interesting thing to read if you're interested in looking it up. The non-renewables here are all that gray on the left-hand chart, and the 26.5% that is ostensibly renewable is the orange. That's hydro at 16, wind almost 6, bio at 2.2, solar only 1.9, just a little less than 2% of the national need. And oceanic, that generally means tidal. Thermal power, again, really small parts. It's a combination of these approaches that we need to take. Getting close to the end here, we ask ourselves, after we had done this set of studies, as a matter of fact, I had been on the road, and several others of my colleagues have been on the road. And by the way, Rick Zillmer here was here last June. My colleague, my Marine colleague and close friend, General Rick Zillmer, and I know he talked about some of these issues as well. But I found myself on the road postulating that it would be far better economically for the United States, and the economics and security are closely linked, far better economically if the U.S. led this transition to advanced energy, did the R&D, did the development, did the deployment, experienced the benefits earliest, than if we followed. And we were sitting around one day having a cup of coffee, and we said, you know, is that true? It might be that it would be better economically over the long haul for the United States to sit back, let others do the development. The Chinese in the PV, the photovoltaic solar panel production, have taken an American idea and developed a really great production and low-cost production process. And we have benefited from that because now almost all of the solar panels installed in the United States are from China. Maybe it would be better if we waited. So we incorporated that into the study. And I can say that there are serious economic opportunities here. Here is our statement from National Security and Advanced Energy, the 2017 report. As new energy options emerge to meet global demand, nations that lead stand to gain. It's absolutely irrefutable. Should the U.S. sit on the sidelines, it does so at considerable risk to our national security. Let's look really quickly at, one more time, at the principal challenge of intermittent renewables. That is, of all the things we've been talking about, geothermal will probably not grow a great deal. Hydroelectric will not grow a great deal. Nuclear power is stalled in the United States, although the Russians and the Chinese together are selling overseas some 80 nuclear power plants in one stage or another, from permitting to actually throwing the switch. So we're not in the nuclear power plant game, except that our technology is being used in what they're offering. But intermittency of renewables continues to be a problem. That's one of the many reasons that Nevada is so darn important, because such great work is being done here. The mining of lithium has started again. The Tesla experience research work is not isolated at Tesla. It's taking place all over, certainly some in Nevada, but also elsewhere in the country. But storage is a big problem in order for greater market penetration to take place for solar and wind. In spite of the Texas example, Texas should not depend on that. So I'm going to wrap up here with the findings, the actual findings of the National Security and Advanced Energy Report. There are 7 of them, 4 on this chart, that the changing energy landscape is going to have serious consequences, economic, diplomatic, and military. Those are all national security concerns. Global transition to advanced energy is underway. And opportunities exist as well as threats to us in that regard. Electric vehicles will play an increasingly important part in displacing oil, and it will matter most in places where oil is used, like the United States now, more in transportation than in anything else. And advanced energy systems will, to some extent, temper the demand for fossil fuels in the future, but the increasing demand around the world for electricity will be reflected in fossil fuels too, regrettably. And the transition to advanced energy can provide the U.S. military with additional options. For mission readiness, the military does not invest in things because they're science projects. The reason all U.S. military aircraft types have been qualified on a mixture of biofuel and avgas is because that may be the fuel that's available in a remote area when you go into operations. Growing demand for reliable electric power will drive the need for more resilient, efficient, and distributed electric power generation systems. Those are the systems to which renewables are most applicable. You can't plan on building another enormous coal-fired power plant or another large natural gas plant and do away with the issues that we confront every day and the vulnerability of the electrical grid. And a wide portfolio of technologies will provide us the best options. The idea is with this great research and development resource we have in this country, we ought to be trying everything. And I'm convinced that where the resources permit, scientists and engineers are trying everything. Again, a little bottom line for Nevada, 25,400 jobs estimated in Nevada, 3.4 million nationwide in advanced energy. I'm not down on the coal energy, and I'm not here to make a political statement, but if we're going to spend $12 billion to sustain 60,000 jobs, that's the total number of jobs in the United States associated with coal, the total. 60,000. We've got 3.4 million jobs already in advanced energy in the United States. I think we're putting our resources in the wrong place. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, sorry, a little excursion here, doesn't mean we shouldn't help the coal miners, but there are a lot of things you can do for 60,000 people with $12 billion that don't involve trying to support the sustainment of a dying industry. And the number of jobs in efficiency, advanced energy, grid, vehicles, and advanced fuels. And from 2016 to 17, there was a more than 10% increase in clean energy generation and natural gas. And in some cases, it was taking place of natural gas already. Nevada ranked, I think this is really important, second for geothermal energy in the United States, and fourth for utility scale solar. All right, I keep saying I'm wrapping up, and I really am wrapping up here. Okay, so Maureen's telling me to shut up. Global energy is changing. Maybe I'm pounding the table too often on this. Populations and rising influence are going to be the cause. Technologies are increasing the variety of approaches we have to get there. The global energy process will impact every nation, especially ours, and we have to lead. And so one more bumper sticker, we must make choices now. So I'm convinced that right now, during the legislative session, we don't lobby. I'm not going to talk about an individual bill, one kind or another, but during this legislative session in Nevada, it seems to me this is the time when there is sufficient advances. There are sufficient advances underway that are under consideration. This can be an exciting time for the state in taking that next big step forward. I think that's it.
Excellent. Double mic'd. Okay, so we started the talk with vulnerabilities and risks to the grid. I think I gave you this question in advance, but I can tell you it was our most popular question, so I'm just going to leap in and say talk to us about the vulnerability of disturbances to the grid from either solar bursts, natural causes, or from a potential electromagnetic pulse from a attack.
Yeah.
And what can we do about it? In less than 30 seconds.
The second part, of course, is the really hard part. We dealt in the report with the damage potentially from electromagnetic pulse, EMP. We did not dwell on it because, with the exception of a very small part of America's electrical grid, and that part is primarily dedicated to military purposes, none of our electrical distribution delivery system is hardened to sufficiently to deal with a serious EMP. EMP is potentially both man-made and natural. Are you familiar with the telegraph example? The latter part of the 19th century, there was a solar burst which actually electrified and electrocuted some telegraph operators in the United States because the energy put on the telegraph wire was sufficient so that if you had headphones on and were touching the key, that it would actually kill you. I don't know the numbers, but this is an example of the enormous power out there that we are not prepared to deal with. Humanity, unfortunately, can cause smaller replications of that with high-altitude nuclear bursts and the like that are particularly designed to provide neutron flow, electron flow. And right now there is no solution to this. I'm afraid it's a mutually assured destruction kind of thing, although I say that without being aware of whether we can cause that or not. And I want to hasten to say that because I've got clearances, but I have no need to know. And so I'm not saying that because I know that we have such a capability. When I was on active duty, we were pretty sure that the Soviets had developed that kind of capability. And so we explained what the EMP problem was, but again, we did not offer a solution, and we felt terrible about doing that, but we do not. One potential benefit of microgrids is that the potential exists to restore that piece of the grid that you've created in a way that can be isolated from the rest of the electrical infrastructure more quickly, far more quickly than you can a mass outage. That's particularly true in the case of an attack using EMP, because the attack can't be, to my knowledge, so widespread that it could take down the entire country, whereas a solar EMP absolutely could.
Excellent. Thank you, Lee. I have a couple other questions on vulnerabilities I hope I can get to, but I'm not sure because we're running short on time. So I'm going to switch over to some questions about a topic you touched on in detail, which was the electric vehicles. So I'm going to roll up a few questions that I'd like you to address, and they come to the practical implications of large-scale introduction of electric vehicles. So a couple things that we'd like you to touch on, and this, recognizing this may not be your area of expertise, but at least what CNA covered in this. First is the conversion of electric vehicles and more electric cars on the roads means less fuel tax for the state and for the federal government. So how do you compensate, and I imagine CNA looked at this, how do you imagine compensating for highway transportation costs when we were pretty heavily dependent on fuel tax? And the other is electric vehicles have to go through some sort of recycling. Their batteries have to be recycled. Are we just producing yet another waste form? And as of now, those batteries aren't really they're not nearly as efficient as combustion engines. So are we ever going to get to the point that they are efficient and cost effective, not producing more waste, and still able to help us pay for the cost of maintaining transportation routes, all in a minute?
Let me start with part two.
Okay.
The recycling piece. At the moment, there is work going on, laboratory work going on, in recycling large flatbed lithium batteries. I don't know where that stands. My expectation is that we will do with that what we have the potential to do with spent fuel from nuclear power plants, and that is reprocess it and put it back into operation. I say that with no chemical background in this whatsoever. I'd like to point to the example. We build cars in the United States that are designed to rust away in junkyards. Germany has imposed on its car makers in the next couple of years, I think, that the requirement that every vehicle you build, Mercedes, Audi, Volkswagen, BMW, every vehicle you build has to be 100% recyclable. And you have to demonstrate in the waste stream how you go about that. And so there is extensive automobile, not battery piece, but extensive research underway, as you can imagine, in Germany among the major car manufacturers, figuring out how to get to that. And they're actually cooperating on that research. Back to part one, paying for roads. The way we are encouraging EVs to be on the market now, I believe of necessity relieves the EVs, the owners, of the need to pay directly the use tax that's associated with gasoline. But if we're talking about 1% or 1.5%, other than the equity argument, gee, why does he not have to pay for this and I do when I buy gas? That's going to sort itself out. I think there will be on charging stations ways of metering that say this is going to an automobile, and therefore the automobile must assume its share of the maintenance and construction of infrastructure.
So introducing a use tax somehow.
I think that's inevitable.
Right.
I'm not here to talk about that policy, but I know it's a problem. It's like this. It's like, well, that's another thing. Rooftop solar introduction onto the grid using smart. I mean, there was a problem with that too, and that's a problem that Nevada attempted to deal with a couple of years ago, or 4 years ago, and didn't do all that well, and tried to do better in the last legislative session. That one's going to get sorted out too.
Okay. So let me pull the thread on that, something that you mentioned in talking about the batteries and the recycling. Nevada is, as you well know, the source of a major part of the world's supply of lithium. And there's no big secret in the fact that Chinese entities are investing and purchasing massive amounts of lithium. What does that mean in terms of security issues inside of Nevada? What should we be aware of? Is this a good thing, a bad thing? And how should we view that issue?
I think there are two tracks. One is the mining is either beginning or resuming in Nevada. I'm not sure which that is for lithium. And there are other places that are not as problematic as the ones Chinese are using. Bolivia and Argentina both are sources of lithium. There's also serious research, this is the other track, serious research underway on advanced batteries that use other things other than lithium. And in many cases, the rare earths that they use are not rare in the rare earths are rare on the chemical chart.
Yes,
they're
only rare.
They're not necessarily rare on the Earth, and much of the research is intended to see if we can exploit things that are more commonly available on the planet as basis for long life batteries.
Excellent. So we ran over. One of your observations was to let my speakers speak and not cut them off, so I let you speak a little longer than usual.
I apologize.
But that means there are a few questions that weren't covered, and luckily Lee has given us a few minutes of his time afterwards to address them. And I'm going to close with one set of questions, but there are several questions about the risks and the practical implications of implementing nuclear power here on various scales. So people who have those questions, you can catch Lee for a few minutes. And also the risks of fracking, earthquakes, water quality, those types of things. But I'm going to close with a set of questions that goes to a different kind of climate change. And that is the political climate. And so the questions, oh yay. When they come from Washington, they have to get one Washington question. So I'm going to roll these up to how is CNA
I was not informed. That's the answer. To my knowledge, I'll start.
How is CNA with all of your work? And I do have a few extra copies of these reports. If you come up quickly, you may get one of these. Also, the energy security in Nevada paper that I wrote as preparation for this program is up here. So please come up and get some background. But the question comes down to how is CNA, with all of your work in advancing renewables and looking at the military issues, dealing with the issues of climate change, energy, water, how are you dealing in this political climate, and what's the outlook? Do you have something optimistic to tell us about your work?
In December of 17, a couple of us from the Military Advisory Board were invited to London and Brussels. In London, we addressed a couple of relevant committees of Parliament and the House of Lords about energy, water, and climate, but more than that, they really wanted to know what the heck was going on in the United States. This was shortly after the announcement was made that we were pulling out of the COP21 agreement. And then in Brussels, we gave a similar presentation to the EU Parliament. Same questions. We talked about what we wanted to talk about. They ask about what you ask.
Right.
What the heck is going on in the United States? And I was able to say, based on, at the time, a dozen state visits, 3 to Nevada, a couple to Texas, Michigan, Ohio, South Carolina, that there is momentum at the states level. And I think that I'm not addressing the CNA piece right yet, except that the CNA Military Advisory Board, when you sign up for this, you sign up not only to participate in these very interesting studies supported by a tremendously capable research staff, you also sign up to hit the road. So most of us are on state visits. We visited 35 states, or at least 100 state visits we've done. I've testified before 4 other state legislatures in addition to my testimony here in Nevada. And everywhere we go, we see innovative things underway. I think that it would be nice to have federal leadership in this right now. If it was 10 years ago and we hadn't had any federal leadership, that would have been a far more serious loss. Mm-hmm. There's going to be federal leadership sometime in the future, I'm convinced. In the meantime, folks at the state level actually have to solve problems, have to deal with issues, are far closer to the voters. If you're talking about electricity, they're far closer to the consumers. And so nobody in Washington gives a hoot about ratepayers for electricity. But people in Carson City do, and people in Sacramento do, and people in Lansing do. And so I think the fact that there is so much activity at the state level is one of the really great attributes of our federal system. And that's what I told them there. I said and also the conference of, the U.S. Conference of Mayors. 1,000 or more mayors signed letters to the conveners of the COP21, the COP process, saying we're still in. There's an outfit called the Carbon Disclosure Project in New York. It's a nonprofit which had the idea that it might be a good idea to ask nations and companies around the world to disclose and discuss their carbon emissions. And that's turned out to be like, it's taken off like wildfire. There are 500 major companies and nations that annually report their carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. And not only that, they report to each other what it is they're doing about it and what their success or failures were last year. There is just so much momentum right now on the climate change issue, and it's taken place at the right time, at the right place in the U.S.
Excellently. Thank you for ending on that positive note.